Delivered his last public remarks in South Carolina on Sunday, urging Americans to keep the faith in a better day to come. Here with us to talk about the 4 years of the Biden administration, political science professor Scott LaDeur. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Good morning, Eric. Good morning, Bill.
So, wrapping up a presidency, 4 years in the works, it's so easy for people to lump it all up and kind of try to summarize it all with one thing he did throughout the 4 years. But let's look at the broad strokes here. Scott, what all was accomplished over the past 4 years under the Biden administration?
Yeah, like any presidency, there's successes and there's failures. And in the immediate aftermath of a presidency, it's a bit challenging maybe to identify entirely those successes and failures because we just don't have the benefit of history. We don't have the benefit of a couple decades to look back and say what really was important, what happened in the future, whose groundwork was laid in this administration. So I'll heavily caveat everything I say. But I think if you try to tally up, as we can see now, the successes of the Biden administration, I think one thing that you'd have to say is that the United States emerged from the COVID pandemic with one of the strongest economies on the planet. So many other economies in Asia and Europe struggled to get off the ground after COVID, and we have our economy has expanded and grown, and jobs have kept coming throughout the last 3 years or so since the pandemic more or less ended. So, I mean, I think at the moment that would be a success. I think you'd also look at the Biden administration as a turning point economically, where both Trump and Biden championed kind of the role of government in the business world, of maybe leaning in the direction of tougher trade restrictions, what economists might call industrial policy. So things like the CHIPS Act, which set aside billions of dollars to bring back semiconductor chip making in the United States, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which had quite a bit of investment in the economy and climate tech and all the rest of it. So I think those would be some things that we might look at the moment and say these were notable efforts in the Biden administration that many might chalk up as successes.
So, Scott, I'm curious as well. I mean, you talk about the advantage of hindsight and letting time pass before judgment is passed. I mean, even with President Carter's passing just a couple of weeks back, there was a lot of reflection on his presidency and how it was really being viewed a lot differently now than it was when he left office in the 1980s. Do you feel the same is true maybe with Biden, but also with Trump? I mean, we've already had a Trump presidency, round one, and round two is starting, but there's just so much politically charged, in such a politically charged environment that both sides are critical of each other, and this was a terrible presidency, this was a great presidency. Maybe it's going to take 20 or 30 years to get a rational perspective of it.
Right. And you don't know the long-term effects. I mean, that's the other thing, right? The Democratic and Republican kind of agreed upon approach to the economy is now kind of to get the government involved and to get them subsidizing and investing in companies. And that has potentially beneficial effects and it has potentially harmful effects. We're not going to know for 25 years. In the meantime, we can bicker and argue and strangle each other over this or that tactical maneuver in politics. But the reality is that it will take decades. And I think your bringing up of President Carter is extremely apt. We look back now at his presidency and say some of the things we thought were failures didn't turn out to be so bad. Some of the things we thought were successes maybe weren't as successful as we thought. History has a way of humbling everybody.
So we only have about 1:30 left with you, Scott, for this section, because we're going to be checking back in with you after the commercial break. But to kind of head out into the world a bit as far as the Biden administration goes, it seems like the shadow that's going to kind of blanket his presidency is going to be what's happening in the Middle East right now. So how do you feel that kind of is going to shape his legacy?
Yeah, the presidents in the Middle East, it has shaped legacies for the last 50 years. And Biden's record in the Middle East is a bit mixed, on the one hand, many might be critical of his staunchly pro-Israel approach in the latest conflict between Israel and Hamas. On the other hand, and there's a lot to criticize there on Israel's part. On the other hand, Israel has remade something of the balance of power in the Middle East by chasing Hezbollah, by weakening Hezbollah and therefore weakening the Syrian dictator, and by thus kind of freeing Lebanon from Syria's orbit and in the long term weakening Iran. On the other hand, who comes to power in Syria? What kind of government is it? There's the old story about when good things happen, the wise will say, well, let's see. And right now, let's see, because it's very much unsure what's going to emerge in that sector of the Middle East, and how Biden's decisions have played into that will be reassessed for decades as well.
Just a short answer here, Scott, within last 30 seconds before our break, and then we'll come back and talk about the future. But part of the legacy in just the last 7 days, and even again this morning, are pardons and commutations for nonviolent drug offenses. This morning, we just had a preemptive pardon, if you would, for Dr. Anthony Fauci. What do you make of all of these kind of last-minute efforts that are kind of coming out of the waning days of the administration?
On the one hand, there tend to be very common. Presidents tend to pardon the most controversial people in the last day or two before they leave office. All presidents do this. So on the one hand, it's not very surprising. On the other hand, the preemptive nature of it, as opposed to pardoning for a previous action, that is notable, if only because clearly Biden and others are unsure or concerned in what direction President-elect Trump will take kind of prosecutorial powers against some very well-known people. So that makes it unique. But in general, presidents writing controversial pardons on their last day in office is a well-worn Oval Office tradition.
Gotcha. Well, Scott, we're going to be checking back in with you in just a bit. So folks, stay right there, because part 2 of our interview with political science professor Scott LaDeur, as we shift our focus to the next 4 years under a Trump administration, what that's going to look like. We'll be right back with more Good Day. We'll talk to you soon, Scott.
Thanks.